So we're here at the Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association annual conference, and we're at the Technology Pavilion for PRMA, which is being managed this year by the Puerto Rico 5G Zone and Blockchain Ignition Lab. And we are hosting on the hour of every hour tech talks with prominent individuals, both locally, nationally, and globally on technology adoption. So our guest this hour is Randy Clark. Randy, you and I got to know each other. Thank you, first of all, so much for joining us today, for the work that you've done for Puerto Rico for the last several years. So you and I met several years ago when you were working as I believe, at Verizon at the time, and you were the vice chair of the National Spectrum Consortium. And you came up with, or you approached us with this idea, and I'm hoping you can give a little more detail on that, that you were calling Labs Across America at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, the National Spectrum Consortium is an OTA. It's a other transactional authority. So it's a rapid acquisition methodology for the Department of Defense to get at disruptive technology faster, where they can circumvent some of the, say, more bureaucratic processes within the FAR and the DFAR. So they were funded by Congress to do accelerated research around 5G. And through that OTA process. And so that was a collaboration between industry, academia, and government to look at disruptive tech in 5G. How can we accelerate dual use technologies, i.e. technologies that impact the warfighter and the lethality, but also impact industry? You know, whether it's agriculture or transportation, you know, health and human services, et cetera. The other primary research vector was zero trust. So how do we improve zero trust, not only from a network perspective, but from a supply chain perspective, and then later on from a data perspective? So one of the things that we did realize from looking at the research and engineering ecosystem is that we needed to iterate on our experiments faster. That going through an acquisition process to build the test bed takes 12 months just to go through the acquisition process. Then it takes another 12 months to build the test bed. Then it takes time to do the experimentation through the phases to get to specific outcomes, right? What experimentation is being done, what insights are being generated, what was successful, what was not successful. And we recognized that we needed to fail fast and iterate faster and do it at with a larger audience of subject matter expertise across DoD, academia, and government. And we need to do it at a lesser expense. We took best practices that we learned from the cyber range, which is a mock-up of the DISA gig here in Quantico, Virginia. And they federated their lab with other federal labs so they could do cybersecurity experiments on the gig, you know, the NIPRNet and the SIPRNet, without impacting the production network. So we came up with the idea of Lab Federation. We called it Labs Across America because notionally, the first lab directors to kind of buy into the concept to wanting to federate and leverage human capital and lab resources, i.e. Test equipment, and of course the actual lab assets, right? Core, RAN, and other elements of the 5G ecosystem were kind of geographically dispersed, right? It was up in the Pacific Northwest in Hawaii. It was Puerto Rico with the 5G zone. It was Texas A&M. It was here in Washington, D.C. So we really, the first constituents that bought into the concept were really spread across the United States.
If I could interject there,
please.
We were so appreciative for being invited into that network because we saw the value in that. But we also, I can't hear those locations and not visualize a map on my mind. It's literally a circle around the entire of the U.S.
Yeah, and that happened by chance, right? It wasn't by design. However, it's a little harder to federate than you might think, right? There's the physical connection, and that works easier and less expensive when it's university to university because we can leverage internet too to do transport. I know that Puerto Rico and Texas A&M were successful in the first leg. You guys did it independent of any true organization, which is absolutely wonderful, right? Leveraging the tier one core assets of Texas A&M to provide core signaling to the University of Puerto Rico, let you stand up first LTE instance and then a 5G instance very quickly at a very low cost because you didn't have to buy a core, right?
And
in a
we
tier
have
one
literal submarine cable that
Yep.
goes from Houston to Puerto Rico.
Yeah, and so amazing that we can extend and create that environment so quickly and at such a low expense. And we have to do more of that moving forward. There's no question about it. You know, it's interesting. There's other federal labs that now have gleaned on the idea of leveraging different lab resources to iterate faster. So even though the National Spectrum Consortium, while I was there, we didn't get the program totally off the ground, the concept stuck, right? And it's starting to happen organically. And I wouldn't be surprised if you saw it happen, you know, within Department of Energy or within the National Science Foundation. But I think we're also going to continue to accelerate the good work that Puerto Rico and Texas have already accomplished.
And we were very proud because with any partnership like that, it's about what you receive from the partnership and what you're able to give to the partnership. And you and I have talked about this. We are so proud of the fact that Puerto Rico is the only place in the country that has a research lab on a network convergence that includes foreign, domestic, terrestrial, non-terrestrial, cooperative and non-cooperative networks. So from a national security, we're the place where you can look at all of those either alliances or firewalls that are necessary in that security.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that's super attractive about Puerto Rico is your sensitivity to resiliency because of natural disasters. And all critical communications in the future that are going to be driving the digital economy have to be more resilient than what we're used to today, right? Commercial carrier networks are 2 nines and a 5 if they sign an SLA, and we have to be, you know, 4 nines, 5 nines, right, in assured communications because we're operating autonomous critical infrastructure to support our economies, right, or our public safety, right, or our national sovereignty.
Right. And we're actually using that as we flipped that narrative to say Puerto Rico is not it's not a negative that we have a regular supply of challenging weather situations. It's a positive because it gives us a ready supply of that test environment that's so critical. So, so thank you. And this is a great segue as we were kind of talking about that and talking about the zero trust data elements that we also have built into our lab. And that's your, you know, one of your areas of expertise. And I know you just worked on and in fact did a presentation for us in our advisory board about the new CMMC program. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's kind of current. I just actually was at the Pentagon yesterday talking with the principal deputy DoD CIO on cybersecurity, Batra, about zero trust data, its place, because they published it inside of their DoD strategy for the first time in November of 2022. So it was 6 months ago or less. And we're talking about the impact that zero trust data is going to have on the economy. A lot of the same things you and I just talked about. But going back to zero trust, right? We recognized several years ago that the microelectronic supply chain had been compromised. And that we had to be more careful from a hardware perspective what hardware was put in critical infrastructure like telecommunications networks, so our near peer competitors could not spy or could not do denial of service attacks on our critical infrastructure. So you've seen some congressional bills to rip and replace certain company equipment because of the potential compromise, but it goes beyond just a company name. It's really the entire supply chain. So, they built the zero trust framework. They understood that we have to clean the supply chain. They understand that our short-term mitigation is going to have to center around protecting data, not necessarily the networks, right? And we also have to understand that that the DIB in the Department of Defense case, which is the defense industrial base, is easy targets because they carry CUI information, they carry a lot of unclassed information that can be combined to create insights for others that could be classified, right? And then, of course, there's our big defense contractors that work on classified information. So what the Department of Defense has done is released cybersecurity maturity accreditation. We're in phase 2 of that. We're still in this period of like notice for proposed rulemaking. That should end here in May this month. And then the rules will be final. And what the CMMC is basically going to dictate is about 110 requirements that companies within the defense industrial base have to comply to ensure that they're caretaking CUI information at the lowest level and protecting it against cyber espionage. So what's interesting about those 110 controls, most of them, 80 of them, are data centric. Right. So it's about protecting CUI information in email. It's about protecting CUI information in storage, in the cloud, et cetera. So zero trust data protection becomes absolutely critical when you look at the low end of the DIB and becoming compliant to CMMC. And the big fear here is that, the defense industrial base has shrunk over the last decade, so it's getting smaller, not larger. And these types of accreditation requirements can be expensive, and small companies and startup companies won't go into the DIB because they can't afford the accreditation process. So we have to make it simpler. We have to make it less expensive. We have to make it easy to deploy so they can be compliant, because it's the small startups that bring the innovation right into the defense industrial base. CMMC, in my opinion,
particularly important in Puerto Rico, where 87% of the island is hub zone qualified.
Yeah. And so it's my opinion that this is the beginning. I think we're going to see other federal agencies require a CMMC-like accreditation to be in the supply chain. Obviously, Department of Homeland Security is logical. I think all federal governments will adopt it to some extent, and or their own version of it. And then, of course, within DHS is the CISA, right? Our critical infrastructure sectors that are going to drive the digital economy, and we'll have to protect them like this as well. So it's
somebody also told me FDA.
Yep. Well, sure.
So
yeah, because agriculture is part of the CISA, right? I mean, health and human services, transportation, energy, public safety.
Critical.
Yep.
Right. So could you real quickly touch on the difference between, because I'm not an expert in technology, I'm an expert in economic development, but the term zero trust architecture versus zero trust network versus zero trust data, because I think that's an important piece.
Yeah, so at a very high level, I mean, the term zero trust, it really is an intelligence community term that runs several decades old, and it's, you trust nobody, right? So when we say zero trust on a network, we don't trust anyone or anything or any object, right? So we have to verify. And we're going to limit access. So, legacy VPNs will give a person access to a network, and then if the bad guys get in, they can move horizontally through the network and actually get to what they want. So the zero trust architecture is a philosophy of building networks with zero trust And there are different ways to go about it, right? You can have a hardware-based zero trust solution that fundamentally put boxes on both ends of the network, and boxes and software, and that's not scalable. I mean, you can do it for a network and create a zero trust network, but as soon as the data leaves the network, it's no longer protected by that hardware-based zero trust solution.
Mhm.
So the value of data is actually its portability and sharing it. So different data owners sharing data to create new data insights is ultimately the new kind of gold of the digital economy.
And is
So,
that what the CMMC is looking for, is that higher level? Not the
well,
perimeter, but the
it's really protecting the suppliers and vendors in the DoD supply chain from cyber espionage on CUI information, and then of course GCC high for top secret. Back to your original question, zero trust data doesn't focus on the hardware; it focuses on the data object. So the advantage is that all data can be protected from sensor to point of rest, or i.e. the data lake, or point of consumption, which would be an AI algorithm, right, or a machine learning algorithm. And
so really important in supply chains where data is moving from, quite literally, physically moving from one location to another.
One network to another, from a private network to a public network, back to a private network. It could be data from sensors from an autonomous car and sensors from an autonomous road. They're owned by different people, but you have to share that data so we can fuse it and create new data insights that have economic value to the ecosystem. And we can't do that with, all the networks would have to have the same kind of zero trust data architectures and hardware in them, and that's just not feasible, and it's not scalable to do it globally. But if you do it on the data object, then the data can travel over any IP modality anywhere in the world and be protected. The other important thing about zero trust data is it enables a data object. So I can provide data sovereignty, meaning that different countries have different rules for the use and consumption of data that has to remain in their borders. So zero trust data actually labels each data object, and I can put a meta or a geotag on it, and I know where the data is, and I can set a policy that says I will not decrypt this data if it leaves this country. So it provides data. Yeah, it provides data sovereignty, and then there's data provenance. Well, because it's geotagged, I know where it is. If I know where it is, I know where it's been, and I can choose chain of custody. So if you think about video frames coming off of a body-worn camera that law enforcement is going to submit into court, 85% of video is thrown out of court because they can't prove data chain of custody, that it was never tampered with. Well, in this case, applying the data zero trust data principles, I have data provenance, I have chain of custody. I can give a log to the court and say the data was never tampered with. It is exactly the data that was generated when the camera took the traffic incident. It goes beyond that because that data provenance also prevents data poisoning. And data poisoning is when data is altered from its original state before it goes into AI algorithm, and then it changes the outcome of the AI algorithm. And so we get a bad outcome. And so we want to be able to prove provenance of the data from the sensor before it goes into the algorithm to say it's actually representing the natural state that it measured. Right. So very, very important.
I think we just had a conversation with two blockchain experts here who were saying that's kind of the difference between the data approach and the blockchain approach, is that the blockchain approach just creates an immutable record. Yep. But the data approach actually secures the data. So it's two different approaches to kind of looking for the same outcome. And that's important in Puerto Rico, where blockchain is important.
Yeah, and I think there's a place for both technologies. And I don't think, I think they're mutually beneficial. And I think in some situations, you're going to use both. Right. Right. And so there's no silver bullet here.
Right.
Right.
getting back to, we talked about the lab federation and the
Mhm.
labs across America and the efficiencies of connecting, and now CMMC, and now I'm going to bring it back to our lab, because we say we're both a lab as a service and we're a collaboration as a service. With we're fortunate to have advisors like you who can help us as we engage with our clientele. And so thinking about that from the perspective of companies, manufacturing companies on the island of Puerto Rico, what's the how does this connected system help them, both from the kind of the lab as a service side and collaboration as a service side?
Yeah. Well, the short-term answer is, yeah, there's compliance to be contracting to the DoD is the first the first hurdle, if you will. However, these requirements, if you will, from a data protection perspective, are going to be table stakes for the smart city of the future. Just table stakes. But it's not a requirement. It's not mandatory for a smart city. Geez, you can go and do anything in a smart city today, right? But you're very vulnerable. And the future of collaboration is going to be based on sharing data in a trusted environment, right? And for the data owners to have control over the encryption keys. That's what zero trust data does. It gives you the label, it lets you set the policy for that data, and it lets you own the encryption key. So at any moment you want to stop collaborating with your data, or your relationship has ended, or something else has changed, you just terminate the keys, and your collaborators can no longer have access to the data. So
we had talked about the right illustration of that. We had talked during the pandemic about the example of the vaccines, which we knew were very sensitive to temperatures at the time, that if you're tracking that, once it leaves the dock of the company that made it, who starts to say that this sensor that's on an entire pallet starts to say, I'm getting too hot? And who gets that information? Does the airport that has to make a decision to put it on the plane quicker make that decision? Does the city that those vaccines are going to, do they get that information and know that their vaccines are potentially going bad? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, that is what I'm talking about. And it's a complex environment. And it's very difficult sometimes to determine the ownership of the data, but generally it's whoever owns the sensor that's generating the data, right? And then I had recent conversations with Next Gen 911, call centers, PSAP, public safety answering points, about their computer-aided dispatch centers, and they want to collaborate the information in the CAD with other federal, state, and local agencies, and they own the data that's generated that comes into their computer-aided dispatch, right? And so if they want to share the data, if it was marked and with zero trust data, then they would own the encryption keys, and they could set a policy that Randy Clark can read that data only in Virginia until May 31st, and then the policy would wipe the keys, and it would be terminated. My point is that we're starting with kind of federal mandates and DoD through CMMC, but this is table stakes for the digital economy. This is the way it's going to work, because you can't those vaccines, if a hacker got in and sent a message that all the vaccines had been destroyed because the temperature went above a certain point, but maybe the temperature never went there, we would have been forced to destroy an entire batch of vaccines, right? And it was just bad information that a hacker got in and gave us. But if we're protecting that with zero trust data, they can't get in to change the information, i.e. the data provenance, before it gets into the analytics.
Oh yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So one last question, and I appreciate your time so much today, and you can hear there's cheering in the background because we are at a conference and it is getting close to the cocktail
hour.
So the last question, and our lab very well, our capabilities and the work that we've done over the last 3 years. What do you see as one of our advisors? How do Puerto Rico manufacturers, how do they engage us, and how do we serve them in some of these areas the best? What are,
Gail, you're doing such a tremendous job down at the Puerto Rico 5G zone. All of the informational meetings, these tech talks are all part of the educational process to inform people on how to make the right business decisions, right? So they can be competitive and they can be secure and they can reduce their risk. And there's so many wonderful things that can come out of the education that we're doing. And I think that setting up a zero trust instance for Puerto Rico to show the businesses, this is how zero trust data works. We have it in our lab, and this is how we can collaborate information. And this is, here, do this demo so you can understand how it works. I think are all giving them access to that, right? And then giving them access to the information of where the federal government is going and why.
yes.
I think is helping people be predictive, skate to the puck and reduce risk, and put their resources in the right places to ensure success. Because, boy, it takes a lot of hard work for startups to generate and innovate on products and services. And it's shameful when they get to a point where it can be productized, but they can't sell it to the right customer because they don't have the right protection profiles in place, right? Or they've been attacked, right? And now they've been compromised. And big companies, even like we've seen what happened to Dish recently. I mean, they were punched in the face, and a big company like that, they're staggering because of it, right? Completely distracting the entire company on their revenue goals, because they didn't pay attention to the cyber frameworks appropriately.
It's so, and again, I feel like we could talk for hours on this topic. We have talked for hours on this topic, but I really appreciate your time today. I appreciate this chance to chat. We will have many more opportunities to do this. And again, thank you for all you have done to help advance Puerto Rico in this region, and and I'm just going to say, for what I'm expecting that you'll do in the future, because I know you have been such a solid partner for us. So we're
absolutely. I look forward to it, and I'm cheering for happy hour too, Gail.
Good. Thank you, Randy.
You're welcome.